Greetings my friends. Welcome back to Season 2 of Short Story Theatre. Once again, this is your host Basil Nightingale. We're gathered here at the little theatre in the alley off Main Street, all ready to bring you another chilling tale from the Bridgewater Triangle in southeastern Massachusetts. The haunted area of a few hundred square miles has more scary stories in it than you'll find in 1,000 public libraries. We often say that the Bridgewater Triangle is an incongruous land where fact and fiction exist together, at the same time, in the same place, in an uneasy truce. And today's tale, The Cold Touch of Death, is a yarn much like the Bridgewater Triangle itself, in that it contains both fact and fiction. In a moment the players of Short Story Theatre will begin the performance, but first a little background. This narrative takes place in the quiet village of Rainham, a wonderful town whose beauty is sometimes tarnished by strange events and creatures. Massive unidentified objects were spotted in the skies above the Rainham dog track. They were as big as jumbo jets, and were seen by hundreds of people including two widely respected media journalists. Our own author Bill Russo had a potentially disastrous meeting with a furry little creature that might look like a large, stuffed animal, but had the potential killing power of an enormous monster. The spot where Bill and his dog Samantha met the creepy Pukwudgie is barely 2 miles from an old ironworks. It was built in the town of Rainham in the 1700s and operated continuously for more than 200 years. An anchor forged in the busy ironworks, more than a century ago, along with a small plaque, constitute the sole remains of that long-ago industrial facility. Actually, that's not quite correct. The ironworks also has a legacy of horror tales that have survived its demise. And today we present one of those stories. Based in both fact and fiction, here now is the Short Story Theatre production of The Cold Touch of Death. Here's our Matthew book to set the scene.
Thanks Basil. It's great to be here for Season 2. Well, that ironworks you spoke about was actually one of the most remarkable businesses in the history of America. Known as the Leonard Iron Works, it began operation in what is now the town of Rainham in the year 1656, and stayed in continuous operation for 220 years. All the way up to 1876. Although the earliest ironworks in what is now the United States began in Saugus and Braintree, several years before the Leonard Works, they were far less successful than the Rainham operation. When a company lasts for more than 2 centuries, you know there's going to be a few fascinating stories in their history. And now Short Story Theatre brings you one of the strangest of the odd tales. It is called The Cold Touch of Death. It begins in the year of 1850, when the man who had managed the ironworks for more than 20 years, died suddenly, in his house, which stood very near to the place described in our weird, Season 1 horror story, Death on a Rope. The gruff old manager of the works was John Alderson. And he was a very successful businessman. Which is to say that he greatly underpaid his workers and skimped on everything, in a never-ending quest for higher profits. Now ladies and gentlemen in the little theater, and people all over the world in podcasts, let the record show that there was nothing extraordinary about his death. It was the natural death of a man who had been given the biblical 70 years. A person who had chosen to continue working right up to his last breath. In fact, his foreman was working with him when he died. They were looking at plans for the construction of a steeple for a new Methodist church in the town of Plymouth. With the victim laid out on his own bed, the doctor and the foreman were discussing the funeral arrangements and other details surrounding the death. The foreman, a man with the typical colonial name of Asa Bittridge, is speaking to Dr. Jedediah Crosby of Taunton.
Well, Doc, it's like this here. We was trying to figure out what it was gonna cost us to fabricate that new Plymouth job up there, when all of a sudden Alderson's head just jerked upwards. His eyes was bulged out and he tried to breathe, but he wasn't able to. Then he collapsed. I saddled up a horse and came and got ya.
You did the right thing, Mr. Bittridge. It certainly looks like age just caught up with old Alderson. He could have had a bad heart. But I wouldn't know that, because he never came into the office for medical advice. I don't believe he thought much of medicine. He certainly was slow in paying the bills every time I had to patch up any of your men who got hurt on the job.
It was nothing personal, Doc. He just hated spending money. The old guy was just plain cheap. He squeezed us on everything. We had to make our tools last twice as long as they should. We had to save every piece of scrap metal from every job and put it in a big boneyard out behind the ironworks. Then, when we get a job, Alderson would make me go out and search through the scraps to see how much of it we could use in the new job.
Well, I guess that makes sense, Mr. Bittridge. Why buy new stock if you have old stock you can use?
Only makes sense on the surface, Doc. I would sometimes have to spend a whole day out in the boneyard piecing together junk scraps that we called drops to make just one single beam. Most of the buildings in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have main beams that were cobbled together with old junk scraps. No telling when a serious accident could happen. The State House in Boston could fall down tomorrow because of the shoddy materials we used when we built it.
Well, it does sound pretty bad when you phrase it that way. At any rate, I will be back in the morning to take care of the body and finish making my report. By the way, someone has to stay with the body.
Someone is supposed to sit up with the dead, Doc, but by someone, if you mean me, Doc, that day of sitting up with a dead thing is usually left up to a family member, or a loved one.
You are correct, Mr. Bittridge. But as far as I know, old Alderson had no family, and nobody he loved, and most certainly, nobody who loved him. But it is tradition, Bittridge. Somebody has to sit up with the dead. It is a New England custom. You do it tonight and I will have some folks from the ironworks come in to take over for you early in the morning.
The doctor prepared to leave. Slowly, he took off his rubber gloves. Bittridge watched in fascination as Dr. Crosby removed the cold and clammy things that felt like the touch of death. Dr. Crosby noticed that the crusty, old ironworks foreman was taking an unusual interest in his gloves.
Mr. Bittridge, you are staring at my gloves. Why do my gloves interest you so?
That's a fair question, Doc. We use gloves in our work, Doc. In fact, you treated a man recently who was badly burned because he did not have any gloves.
Yes, young Walter Smith foolishly was working his cutting torch without putting on his gloves. I told him to always put his gloves on, before doing any work with heating elements.
Didn't have no gloves, Doc. Smitty wore out his last payer when he tried to get new ones from the stockroom. He was told, under Alderson's orders, he could not have a new payer for 6 more weeks. I told you, Alderson shot at us on everything. Can't say I'm sad he's gone. If they give me his job, things will change around here. I'll guarantee you that. Might not make as much money, but the men will be safer and happier.
I am sorry to hear about this very sad situation, Mr. Bittridge. I hope you do get to take over his job. Well, I am off now. Will you be okay until about 8 in the morning? I will have people in by then, to relieve you.
Sure, yup. Yeah, I'll be just fine, Doc. Now, you can call me Asa, now that we're gonna be probably working together a little more. I'll sit up with the dead guy, and I'm gonna write up a new estimate for that steeple job over there in Plymouth. I'll make sure that at least that job is going to be done right.
The doctor departed, and Asa Bittridge sat down in one of the 2 chairs in the small home of the late John Alderson. The dwelling was a few miles away from the ironworks, at the edge of a lake that would one day be known as the Deadly Nip. The Cruel Nip is a lake that is just 3 feet deep on average, but every summer, it claimed 1 or more drowning victims, until it was finally closed off to swimming by the selectmen many years later. Sometime in the 20th century, Asa looked around him, and was disgusted at the sight of the dreary little cottage. He began talking to himself.
He wasn't just stingy with us at work. He was even cheap with himself. Look at this dump. He was the head of a business that has hundreds of workers. The company does work all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and yet the dang fool lived in a 1-room house with just 2 wooden chairs, a small table, little bit of a couch, and a tiny twin bed. He had a desk, a dresser, and a closet full of identical cheap black suits. That's it. That's all the dang fool had.
Asa glanced casually at the formless, sheeted hulk on the bed opposite him, and began to study the steeple plans, by the light of the dim lamp which stood on the rough table.
Well, Alderson, you old goat, you old Scrooge, you old miser, tonight you are in the best mood ever. Why, you ain't once complained or groaned or moaned or told me that I'm wasting the company's money. I have to say that death certainly does become you, you old skinflint.
Outside, a black darkness raced in, obliterating the path, the tree line, and even the sky. From Asa's vantage point at a dirty windowsill, in the dim light of the lamp, he found that it was a strain on his eyes to try to do any more work, so he folded up the plans and set his arms down on the bare table to act as a pillow for his head. Before he closed his weary eyes, he looked across the room at Alderson. He had worked with the man for more than 20 years, and not once did Alderson have a visitor or a friend. He took no holidays and spent every day, including Sundays, working in his office on the 2nd floor of the main building of the iron works. Out of doors, the wind had picked up and was shearing branches from the sheltering pines and tossing them at the little hovel. With a thud, a freshly severed limb struck the door of the house. Asa Bittridge jerked as he realized the noise was merely a windswept branch. Out of the corner of his eye, Asa noticed something. By the door, on a frail-looking 3-legged table, was Dr. Crosby's heavy, black, medical bag.
I wonder if perhaps the good doctor left some medicine in that bag of his, and maybe it's some good, strong medicine.
Asa Bittridge rose from his chair, rubbed his eyes, and then was delighted to find a nearly full bottle of brandy among the bandages, scissors, scalpels and such. He drank liberally, and straight from the bottle. The doctor certainly wouldn't mind him having the brandy, he assured himself. He was, after all, doing him a great favor by sitting up with the dead. There was a detective magazine in the doctor's bag, so Asa turned up the lamp and began reading. After a time, he looked up from the literature and his eyes fell upon the bed, with its silent occupant. He was startled, involuntarily, as if he had for a moment forgotten the presence of the corpse, and was unpleasantly reminded of it. Later, he realized that every time he looked up from the magazine, he would peer over at the dead man, and each time, he had a momentary fright, as though he were seeing him laid out for the first time. The fright was light and instinctive, but he felt angry at himself. The wind died down to a whisper before evaporating into nothing. There were no hooting owls, no croaking frogs, no buzzing crickets. He realized that utter and deadening silence had cloaked both the house and the night. Asa Bittridge shook himself as if to rid his mind of wild speculations, and went back to his reading. A sudden rogue gust of wind whipped through the window, in which the light in the lamp flickered, and went out suddenly. Cursing softly, Asa groped in the darkness for matches, burning his fingers on the lamp chimney. He struck a match, and relit the lamp. Then he glanced over towards the bed, and he got a horrible shock. Alderson's face stared blindly at him. The dead eyes, wide and blank, framed in the gnarled gray features. But even as he instinctively shuddered, Asa's reason explained the apparent phenomenon.
Asa Bittridge, you danged old fool. Get a hold of yourself. What are you scared of? That sheet there that covered the corpse was carelessly thrown across the face by the doctor. That's all. And that sudden puff of wind simply tossed it aside. You dang fool. Yet there is something grisly about the thing, something fearsomely suggestive, as if in the masking darkness a dead hand had cast aside the sheet, just as if the corpse was gonna rise up and come and get me.
Mr. Asa Bittridge was an imaginative man, but he quickly cast off his own ghastly thoughts, and crossed the room to replace the sheet. The dead eyes seemed to stare malevolently, with an evilness that transcended the dead man in life. The workings of a vivid imagination, Asa knew, and he recovered, the gray face shrinking back, as his hand chanced to touch the cold flesh. Slick and clammy. The touch of death. He shuddered with the natural revulsion that the living have for the dead. And then he went back to his chair and his magazine.
Settle down, Asa, you dang flibbity gibbet. Settle down, old boy. Well, the night's beginning to turn towards morning. I think I'll just lie down on that skimpy little couch over there and get some rest. Now, I might fall asleep, but I'll leave the light burning. That's not 'cause I'm afraid. It's just the custom, see? It's the custom to leave the lights burning for the dead,
The tough old ironworker did not want to admit, even to himself, that he realized that he had a deep dislike of the thought of lying in the darkness, in the same room, with the corpse of Alderson. He dozed. Then, he awoke with a start, and looked at the sheeted form on the bed. Silence reigned over the house, and outside it was very dark. The hour was approaching midnight. The worst time of all for a man with a fragile mind. He stared again at the bed where the body lay and found himself more disturbed than ever by the sight of his sheeted former boss. A bizarre idea formed in his mind, and grew. He imagined that beneath the sheet, that dead and lifeless body had become a strange, monstrous thing, a hideous, conscious being. An evil monstrosity that watched him with eyes which burned through the fabric of the cloth. This thought, of course, he explained to himself by the legends of vampires, and undead ghosts and such. Man fears death, thought Asa, and he decided that some of this fear of death took hold on the dead so that they too were feared. And the sight of the dead gave birth to grisly thoughts, and gave rise to dim fears of hereditary memory, lurking back in the dark corners of the brain. At any rate, that silent, hidden thing was getting on his nerves. He thought of uncovering the face, on the principle that familiarity breeds contempt. The sight of the features, calm and still, in death, would banish, he thought, all such wild conjectures as were haunting him, in spite of himself. But the thought of those dead eyes staring in the lamplight was intolerable. So at last he laid down and blew out the light. The ghastly fear was stealing upon him so insidiously and gradually, that he was not aware of the growing horror that was hungrily eating up his reason. But after he put out the light, and the corpse of greedy old Alderson was out of sight, things assumed their true character and proportions, and Asa Bittridge fell asleep almost instantly. On his lips was a faint smile for his previous folly.
I'm awake now. Hey, I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm straining to see something, anything. But the room is all blackness, and outside is so dark that no gleam of light can be coming through the window. I'm gonna force my shaking hand to light the lamp. No, I can't do it. Sitting here in the dark with a fiendish corpse is bad enough, but I dare not light the lamp for fear I'm certain that my reason will be snuffed out. My reason, my sanity will be snuffed out like a candle at what I might see if I turn on the light.
Asa Bittridge sat there, his blood freezing, and fought out his silent battle. Faint glimmerings of reason had begun to soften his fright, but then a soft, stealthy sound again froze him. He did not recognize it as the whisper of the night wind across the windowsill. His frenzied fancy knew it only as the tread of death and horror. He sprang from the couch, then stood up, undecided. Escape was in his mind, but he was too dazed to even try to formulate a plan of escape. Even his sense of direction was gone. Fear had so stifled his brain that he was not able to think consciously. The blackness spread in long waves about him, and its darkness and void entered into his brain. His motions, such as they were instinctive. He seemed shackled with mighty chains, and his limbs responded sluggishly. He was in a state of pure panic. A terrible horror swelled up inside Asa, and reared its grisly shape. Asa was convinced that the dead man was behind him, was sneaking up on him from the rear. He no longer thought of lighting the lamp, he no longer thought of anything. Fear filled his whole being, there was room for nothing else. He backed slowly away in the darkness, hands behind him, instinctively feeling the way. With a terrific effort he partly shook the clinging mists of horror from him, and, the cold sweat, clammy upon his body, fought to orient himself. He found the bottle and drained the last of the brandy, then hurled the empty container at the wall. Asa could see nothing. But the bed was across the room, in front of him. He knew this. He was backing away from the bed. That was where the dead man was lying, but Asa felt that the thing that had been Alderson in life was now behind him. If the Alderson thing were, as he felt, behind him, then the old tales were true. Death did implant, in lifeless bodies, an unearthly animation. Dead men do walk. Dead men do roam the shadows, to work their ghastly, and evil will, upon the living. These conclusions he did not reach by any reasoning process, they leapt full-grown into his terror-dazed brain.
Alderson, the old miser, is dead on the bed. I know that, but he ain't there. I know that too. The monster he has become is behind me, but I'm backing up. I'm backing up because I'm afraid of what's on the bed just as much as what's behind me. But I got my hands behind me in case I bump into something. What's that? My hands! They're touching something! something slick and cold and clammy, like the touch of death. No! No! Get away from me, Alderson! Get away from... Ah!
The next morning, the doctor and some of the workers came to the cursed house of death. They found 2 corpses. John Alderson's sheeted body lay motionless upon the bed, and across the room lay the body of Asa Bittridge. Next to the rickety 3-legged table, where the doctor had left his bag and his gloves. His rubber gloves. Slick and clammy to the touch. Like the touch of a hand groping in the dark. A hand of one fleeing from his own fear. Rubber gloves. Slick and clammy and cold. Like the cold touch of death. That is all for this episode, my friends. You have just heard Bill Russo's play, entitled The Cold Touch of Death, on Short Story Theatre, Season 2. Yes, we are done, for now, but, I have a little favor to ask. If you like our work, please do just that, like it. Like it on Facebook and anywhere else on social media that you frequent. Please give us a 5-star rating, so that we can continue our work in the little theater in the alley just off Main Street. As always, this is your host Basil Nightingale saying thanks for listening, and please, come back again, real soon. Won't you?